Hey guys, what is up and welcome back to the channel. I'm Sen, I'm a 4th year medical student here at Cambridge, and today we're going to talk about my first ever night shift. Given that now I've begun my clinical studies in medicine, a lot of my time is spent seeing patients. Usually as a student, we go into hospitals during the daytime, but on rare occasions we get the opportunity to spend a nighttime in a hospital environment to see what it's like. If you haven't yet done so, please do go follow my Instagram. I post a lot of interesting stuff on there and more frequently than here on YouTube, so I'm sure you guys will love it. So one day my Cambridge clinical supervisor mentioned that he was doing a week of nights, and so I asked whether I could join him. And unsurprisingly, the sub-dean of the medical school was more than happy to let me go and see what doctors do during night times in big hospitals such as Addenbrooke's. Addenbrooke's is a trauma centre, and so you get some pretty big cases coming in from all across East Anglia. For those of you who don't know where East Anglia is, it's practically the east of England. It covers quite a large area, and Addenbrooke's even has a helipad on top, on which helicopters can land and patients can be brought in for emergency care. So I wasn't really sure what to expect from this placement at all. Usually a night shift lasts from around 7 PM to around 7 AM. I went along at about 8-9 PM so that I could do a bit of work up until 6 PM, have some supper and then rest up before I went into the hospital. My aim was just to try and see how long I could last and how many different patients I could see during this time. Now the only other experience that I had of a night shift was when I was up in Huntingdon in one of the regional hospitals, and that wasn't a proper night shift. I was only there until about 8 PM, whereas this time I'd spend the early hours of the morning in the hospital. In today's video, I want to share with you guys my first ever experience of doing a night shift as a medical student. I'm pretty sure once a doctor, these things will be very, very common throughout my rota, but I thought as a medical student, as a 4th year, I'd just dive into it and see what it's like, so I could get a good idea of the challenges that doctors face whilst working throughout the night to look after patients. So I rocked up at 8-9 PM, parked my car, then walked into the hospital. It was a fairly nice evening, I was fairly well rested. I had made sure to slightly change my sleep schedule just so that I wouldn't be too tired during the shift. I walked up to the ward, and the ward I was on that evening with my clinical supervisor was the ward to which non-urgent emergency cases are sent. So you go to the emergency room, there are some cases which are considered very, very urgent and they're sort of dealt in a different way because a patient might be bleeding, a patient might need emergency surgery. Patients who've come to the emergency room who are still important to look after but not as severe with their condition are then sent to this other ward called the emergency acute unit. So my tactic to stay up all night was to stay as hydrated as possible, avoid caffeine until I really needed it, but also to have a few snacks here and there. So I took along some fruit, a lot of water, and a flask of coffee just in case I needed it. I'm not really the biggest fan of buying coffee at hospitals because all hospitals only seem to have Costa coffee shops, and the Costa coffee menu isn't the most exciting, but thank God they didn't have Pret a Manger coffee. That stuff is like charcoal. I took along my own snacks and drinks and refreshments, and then I sat down with my clinical supervisor and talked through the cases that had come in that night. To Addenbrooke's, every hour there'd be 5 or 6 admissions in the early hours of the morning, and so there were a fair few patients coming into this emergency acute unit. It's actually quite interesting speaking to the doctors who were beginning their night shift. They were all discussing how their rotas change and how their rotas are planned and how night shifts are evenly distributed amongst a variety of doctors, whether they're junior doctors or registrars, and sometimes even consultants on call. Now the first few hours are fairly easy. We came across a patient who had a suspected heart attack, so we had to do an ECG on her, we had to do a blood test and get those sent off. And although I can do blood tests quite well, she seemed really nervous. So as a student, I didn't want to discomfort her too much by doing the blood test myself, and the nurse did that. I was then able to take a good history from her. There's another gentleman who had, I think, a bit of a heart problem, and surprisingly, he had a metallic heart valve in there. And then when the junior doctor asked me to listen to his chest whilst doing a cardiac examination, the first time around I didn't actually hear the metallic valve because it was very different to what I'd expected it to hear. I'd heard it to be a very distinct clicking tinny sound, but actually it's a very subtle click sound that's quite muted and very crisp. So you really got to listen out for that. And I only noticed it the second time when I went back. And one of the doctors said to me, you should have heard something, go back and hear it. So yeah, the metallic heart valve was quite cool to listen to. We also went and examined a few other patients, simple respiratory and cardiology examinations, alongside taking a history. And the doctor that was supervising me was fantastic. He allowed me to open the conversation, get the basic history, and then he did a bit more probing as required to get the specific details out to help him help the patients as much as he could. So we hit around 1 o'clock in the morning and I was still going strong. At this time I'd sort of, finished a lot of the coffee, and then one of the doctors there said, "Sen, would you like to go to the emergency room since quite an interesting patient with delirium had been admitted." Delirium is a state of confusion, and this patient had also been diagnosed with early onset dementia. So before we went into A&E, this junior doctor sat down with me and spent a good 1 hour talking about dementia and delirium and really helped me understand the background of this illness. And I found this one-on-one teaching amazing. It was really nice that the doctor could sit down with me and explain this so well, and also explained it in very layman's terms, because as a medical student we don't understand all the jargon and lingo just yet. So when doctors explain it to us, it's a very good way of learning. So after that, we then got kitted up in PPE gear. Patients who come into the emergency room haven't yet been tested negative for COVID. And before I could even get into PPE, I had to get changed into scrubs. So I quickly ran to the changing room, took off my shirt and chinos, and then put on some hospital scrubs. Generally in hospitals, to sort of reduce the chance of taking home bugs from the hospital, especially during COVID, what they recommend is that you wear scrubs when seeing high-risk patients. Full PPE is a very, very different experience. Breathing is very difficult. On top of that, a visor, a full gown, gloves. We then went into A&E of Addenbrooke's and then spent a good hour speaking to this patient, trying to understand this patient's story. Now, I started off myself asking a few questions, and I was surprisingly bewildered. Given that the patient themselves was quite confused given the context of their illness, when I'd asked the history and when I was trying to sort of work out what exactly happened and how the patient had ended up in hospital, because the patient was giving me conflicting information, I found it very difficult to sort of understand the whole picture. And even when I tried to summarize back to the patient what happened, the patient would then add new bits of information that would then contradict previous things that he'd said. And so very quickly I realized that interviewing patients in this sort of state, in this confused state, is a very tough thing to do. Now, the junior doctor that I was with was fantastic. He was then able to sort of take on the conversation and lead it further and ask the right questions, because when patients are generally in a confused state, they can go off track from what you've asked them. And so this doctor was really good at bringing them back onto the topic to really get them to answer the key questions that he wanted answers to. Now, this was now heading to around 2 a.m., 3 a.m. And given that I was in full PPE and speaking to a patient that was confused, I was beginning to get a bit confused myself. And this is a really funny thing. So after we'd seen that patient, I sat down with the junior doctor again, discussed the patient with him and what I'd do in terms of further investigations and what examinations I'd want to do. And after that, I decided to call it a night. So it lasted 5 hours on my first night shift, and then I was completely zonked out. I wouldn't say it was actually the exhaustion that made me call it quits. It was more so the sort of difficulty of speaking to such a confused patient that had tired me out very quickly and then had sort of burnt through all my energy to a state where I just realized it would be best for me to go home, sleep it off, and then reflect on the lessons I'd learned the next morning. So I got undressed, and then I went back to the doctors in the ward, said thank you to everybody, got my things, and then I headed home at 3 o'clock in the morning. And as you can see, I was outside the hospital, pretty relieved that I'd managed to get myself out of there. It was a really insightful experience, and I was amazed at how the doctors were able to last until the early hours in the morning, till 8, 9 a.m. Of course, yes, they did have some coffee breaks, but the fact that they can do all this admin work, looking after patients and making sure patients are given the right medication they need as soon as they come there, I was just amazed as to the determination and the sheer willpower that they have as medical professionals. Now, the walk back to my car was freezing cold. I'm pretty sure it was around 3-4 degrees, but it felt like -1, -2. I didn't wear too many layers. It was literally my shirt and then a sort of a thin down full coat over the top. So I was, getting quite cold walking back to the car, and a tad dizzy too since I was getting tired. As you can see, the roads were completely deserted, and this is one of the main junctions at Cambridge heading towards the hospital. No cars at all. And as you can see, the water vapor in my breath was very evident in this very cold weather. Then got to my car, jumped in, turned the heating on full whack, put the seat heating on, and I drove back through town. And actually it was amazing driving through Cambridge at 3 o'clock in the morning. No cars, no students, no bicycles other than me, and I was able to safely make it back home, quickly undress, have a quick shower, and then tuck myself into bed. So yes, that was my first experience of a night shift. I do hope that I can have a few more of these and hopefully last longer. I actually am on the transplant rota that Cambridge has, and if you're on the transplant rota, if there's a transplant case that happens in the middle of the night whilst you're on shift, then you have to get up and go to the hospital and help out with the surgery that takes place. And I had one night where I was on call and I wasn't called in, but I think I have a second night coming up later in December, and fingers crossed that I'm going to be called in for that. It'd be wonderful to go into hospital and help out with a transplant case. I hope you found the story interesting. Yeah, it was quite exciting, quite tiring, and I think this night shift experience has really helped me understand the ability to adapt that you need to have as a doctor. Of course, it's very luxurious working in the daytime, but equally so, it's important that you can work throughout the night if you're scheduled and needed to ensure that patients' lives are looked after and that they're given the best chance possible, whatever time they come in. If you haven't done so, please do go follow my Instagram. Like this video if you found it really interesting, and subscribe if you're new to the channel as well. I'd love to have you guys join me on my journey. If you have any questions about what a night shift involves or anything, then comment down below in the comments. And as always, I'll catch you guys soon in the next video. Cheerio.